Section 5. Networking and Async Programming in Swift. In this section, we're going to learn how to query data from a server and how to parse the response from the server that will come in a JSON format into our Swift classes. Then we're going to use the new Combine framework by Apple that helps us to write cleaner code. And we will finally learn about the new Swift result, what it is, and how we can use it to improve our async coding style. Query data with URLSession. In this first video, we're going to use URLSession, which is a very easy to use API, to interact with a server. We're going to use the Swappy API for that. A URLSession basically uses tasks to fulfill certain requests. And there are 4 different types of tasks. First, which we're also going to use, is the data task. Then there is an upload task that would be used to upload data, a download task that could be used to download large amounts of data, and a streaming task if you want to stream data like a video. But I would say, let's get started with our first networking app. So for this app, just fire up Xcode, create a new single view app project, and let's call it Networking Swift UI. We just tick Swift and Swift UI here, and we don't need any of the boxes. Just save it somewhere, and we're ready to go. Let me make that window a little bit smaller. For our first trial of the URLSession, we're just going to create an initializer for this content view. And here we're going to request some data from an API called Swappy. That's basically an API that gives you a list of all the characters that appeared in the various Star Wars movies. So the first thing we need is a URL. Just going to copy paste that here. It's called swappy.co/API/people. And that endpoint returns a JSON that basically contains a list of all the Star Wars characters. So the next thing we need is a data task. Remember the 4 different types of tasks that are available for URLSession. And you create a data task by first creating a URLSession. You don't always have to create one yourself. If you're fine with some default parameters set by the system, you can also use this shared singleton object that the system provides. So you already get a session ready to go. And then we're going to say data task with URL and completion handler. All right, so as URL, we're obviously going to pass the URL. And for the completion handler, just use the auto completion and name the parameters: data, response, and error. And in this completion handler, that will be called whenever the data task returns some data. For now, we're just going to print the data. And all that's left is basically to start the data task and to tell the data task that we want to download the data. That is done via a method called resume. I don't know why it's not called start, but it's the way it is. All right, now let's run the app on the simulator and let's see what our output will be. So the app is starting up, and here in the terminal we see optional 5800 bytes. So that doesn't tell us all too much. What we need to do is to convert the data into a string first. You can do that very easily by first checking if the data is not nil, and then converting the data into a string with a string initializer. You can pass the data, and you have to specify an encoding, which is usually UTF-8. Now, let's print that string here. Let's also ignore the error for now, and if there would be one, and let's just run the app again. All right, that looks already much better. We get a JSON response down here of all the different characters. It's a really long JSON response, but don't worry about that for now. We'll deal with that in the next video. Now, there can also always be potentially errors when networking is involved. You can either have a slow or no internet connection, or maybe the user is out of data, or the server is not responding for some reason. So that's why it's always wise also to handle error cases. So in this case, you should write an else statement and check if an error is present. And if an error is indeed present, we can, for example, print the localized description. Or else print a no data received. In your app, it's obviously important to handle that with actual user feedback instead of simple print statements. But for this example, I think that's already enough. Now, what is if you're not okay with the default configurations that URLSession.shared provides you with? Well, there is a lot more to URLSession than just this simple single. You can, for example, create your own URL request first. That URL request actually also takes a URL, and it can also specify certain cache policies and also a timeout interval. So we can again, for example, pass here the URL, and as a cache policy, we could use return cache data or else load. That means that it will be very fast. It will return data very fast in case the data is already loaded. But pay attention, you will only return cached data if cached data is there. And we could also set the timeout interval to maybe 10 seconds. Users are very impatient, they don't like to wait. And then if we want to specify our own URL session, we basically just create a URL session and pass a so-called configuration. Now that configuration, we'll create it up here, is called URL session configuration. And on that configuration, you can basically also set more information on or restrict access, for example, to cellular data. And you can also add additional HTTP headers, set cookies, and so on and so forth. So if you want to have a lot more control over the URL session, you're going to have to use the configuration file. So in our case, let's just take the standard configuration. Now, what's the request for? You can create a data task also by passing a URL request instead of a simple URL. So in this case, we're going to say data task with URL request, and the completion handler will basically use our completion handler from before. So let me remove that code here and let's see what happens. So our app did now crash, unfortunately. Okay, so what if we need to have more control over the URL session and over the request and everything? Let me introduce you to the little bit more sophisticated version instead of just using this singleton object of URL session. What we can do to get more control over how the URL session behaves is we can first of all use a URL request instead of a simple URL. You get a URL request by calling the URL request initializer, and then you pass basically a URL, which is also URL in our case. And then you can, for example, provide a caching policy. In our case, we're going to use return cache data and else load, which means if a cache is present, that will be basically returned instantly, and otherwise the data will be loaded from the net. And then you can also set a custom timeout interval, for example, 10 seconds. Users are impatient and it's important to return data fast and also fail fast if, for example, the server is not reachable. All right, now all that changes really with the data task is that you pass a request instead of the URL. So you can simply pass a request instead of a URL. The completion handler stays the same and everything else more or less also stays the same. If you need still more control, you can create your own URL session instance to which you have to pass a configuration object to. We're just going to call that config here and create the config object up here. And then we're just going to use the default URLSession configuration. And on the configuration, you can restrict, for example, cellular access. You can add additional HTTP headers, cookie policies, and whatnot. So you have really fine control over how the URLSession behaves. We don't have to alter anything in our example here, really. So we're just going to replace the shared URLSession with our custom URLSession object. And then let's just run the app one more time. The only change we will see is that it now should return instantly because it's loaded from cache. All right, have you seen that? The app started and we have already had the full response here. So that's the return cache and else load policy at work. Now that was networking with URLSession.